well as watching us online. My name is Goda Rebite, and I will be moderating and hosting this event a little bit. And before that, I want to tell you a little story. Because 2 years ago, I realized that we need to create a science communication course for the Lithuanian scientists. And I approached Dr. Gina Danauskaitė, who, to my surprise, accepted the challenge because the Lithuanian Journalism Center had already started different initiatives with expert training, with expert databases for journalists, and so on and so on. And 2 years later, after one no from the Gapminder Institute, and after searching for partners, for auditoriums, for places where to host this event and so on, we can finally say that we have Anna Rosling from Gapminder Institute. So just, give a huge round of applause for that. Yeah. During our first meeting, Gina was like, we need to bring Gapminder to Lithuania. And her enthusiasm was so infectious that we also believed even after we heard our first no. So Gina, I think you have a little bit more to tell about this for everyone here, so the stage is yours. This is Gina. Yeah.
Thank you, Goda, for telling all the burdens that we went, tackled and successfully went through. And now we have Anna here in Vilnius, in Lithuania, and this is the most important thing. And we have a huge audience here, which is also very, very important. Another important thing, and all of us, we are gathered here because we care about making sense of the world that surrounds us. Some of us are journalists, some of us are data scientists, work in business, NGOs, and we all are making decisions. And it is very important that those decisions we make, they are fact-based. And the idea of getting Gapminder and Anna Rosling to Vilnius was after reading a Factfulness book that they wrote together with late Hans Rosling, Ulla Rosling, and Anna Rosling-Ronlund. And they actually had a lot of criticism towards journalists, activists, and other decision makers. And I thought that us as journalists and people working in other areas, they should actually pay attention to that criticism, and they, as well as criticizing, they also had a lot of great advices of how to judge better. So I hope that after this lecture we will get more knowledge how to do better things that we are doing, and also this all event would not have been possible with our long partners, Swedish Embassy in Vilnius, Swedish Institute, who are funding a lot of the activities for this particular lecture and other activities at Journalism Center. Also, this great place from ISM. Thank you very much, President of ISM, and all the people working here, especially Salomea, who took care of all the small things while preparing for this lecture. And Swedbank, who also came forward and helped to bring this lecture, public lecture, for you today. So that's from me. Thank you for all of you. And we will have very soon Anna, who's an orchestra, a person orchestra. She's sociologist, she's artist, she's designer, she's a social innovator, public educator, like a dream. So yeah, very shortly, and now maybe we would like to invite also other people who are very important in organizing this event to say a few words.
Thank you, Gina. I'm not hearing any applause. Yeah. Of course, it is important to challenge our worldview, whatever we do, and thanks to Gapminder and Anna for helping us do that and for helping us humbling ourselves a little bit. And now I would like to give the stage to our main sponsor, to head of mission at Embassy of Sweden, Pierre Backman, who they believed in our idea 2 years ago and sponsored the entire project, because this event is just a part of the project. We also do courses, online courses as well, and so on. And these people from the Embassy of Sweden and from the Swedish Institute believed in this project, and it was like their gift to Lithuania to have a more fact-based worldview. So Pierre, the stage is yours. Yeah. I don't think that this is working.
Okay. I will try to do it this way. And I can just start by saying that from the part of the Swedish Embassy, we never even once said no to invite Anna and Gapminder to come here. Thank you. So, thank you very much, and thank you for coming here. And on behalf of the embassy, I welcome you to this. And it is a topic of a lecture of facts, what they are and how they are sometimes perceived. And of course, thanks also to Lithuanian Journalism Center, to the Marius Jakulis Jason Foundation, to ISM, and Swedbank, and not last but not least also Swedish Institute, who helped us to get this going. And you probably have heard the name Rosling before, and maybe you come here to experience firsthand what a Rosling brand lecture is all about. As you know, Hans Rosling was, in his time when he was still alive and active, he was recognized as one of the top 100 most influential people, not in Lithuania, not in Europe, but in the world. And you have to accomplish quite a bit to be on such a list. And we are very grateful that his son Ola and his daughter-in-law Anna continued his work also after he passed away. So welcome, Anna, to Vilnius. I had the privilege at one point to experience a lecture by Hans Rosling before he passed away in 2017. And this was a lecture among colleagues at the foreign ministry. And as foreign ministry, we like to think that we know a little bit more than most people about what things are around the world. And Hans, he started this lecture by asking a few factual questions to test us about living conditions in other countries, about health conditions, about health care, about how many children in each family, and so on. And if I remember correctly, Hans described some sort of a baseline which you would get in knowledge if you have a chimpanzee who would throw arrows on the wall. That's the baseline. And having responded, we found out that we were a little bit better than the monkey, but we were not a whole lot better than the monkey. And we did feel a little bit uncomfortable after that. Don't we do any more than this? And then he started his presentation. And after this presentation, it became clear to us that the way we saw the world was not at all as the world was, if you take into consideration facts that he had presented in an interesting way. And if I remember correctly, he used circles, and he could use toilet paper rolls, and coffee cups to illustrate these things. Because this is not all of us who can look at an Excel sheet full of figures and find some useful trend or useful message in it. So this was extremely helpful. So we were dazed and confused after this lecture, and a little bit in shock, but also we felt smarter, and also maybe a little bit critical towards the things and the perception that we have about of things around us. So I mean, it is. Okay, there you go. That we are not all geniuses. We need help sometime to understand things. And in this way, I think Anna and Gapminder has done us an enormous service in all fields, in business, and not least in politics. Unfortunately, today, we also live in a world where there are competing narratives about what the world is and how the world is organized. And there's also a world of alternative facts. Some people are try to distort how things are to make us serve their causes better. And this has also been turbocharged by social media. Social media enables people to communicate with each other. And this is, of course, a good thing, because we need more communication. But the other backside of that coin is it also enables people who do not want people to understand the world as it is. So in this situation, it is extremely important to find out and be able to distribute the facts. And 2024, this is a year when there will be elections in many countries. There will be elections in Lithuania, in European Union, in Russia, in Belarus, in India. A lot of people are going to go to the polls to select their leaders. And in order for them to select leaders that can make the right decisions, they need to have the right information. So, Anna, it's your responsibility now to make sure
no
that
pressure.
no pressure, but at least you could provide us with some tools to understand this world a little bit better. And then hopefully we can all make better decisions. So, welcome, Anna.
Thanks. I have this one, so I stick with that. So, yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming here. Yes? What should I do?
We just wanted to thank to ICM, because I know that the president of ICM wanted to say a few words, but
sorry.
no, it's okay. And also Ernestus from Swedbank, but it's okay. This is because these people, are here for Anna, and unless Dalius maybe, let's go on. Okay,
sure?
Let's do this. So Anna. And I need your applause as well, because it took us 2 years for Anna to be here. Anna, yeah, it's okay. Take the stage.
Yeah,
Blow our minds.
feels almost embarrassing that I said no first, right? And I think actually even twice I heard. So I'm sorry for that, but now I'm here. So I'm really happy to be here, and I hope I can bring you something meaningful. So I come from the Gapminder Foundation, and we have the mission statement that we want to promote a fact-based worldview that everyone can understand. And I mean, it sounds a bit bold and also a bit dull, I guess, but actually it's pretty interesting, I would say. I think, of course, personally. So here's me, this is Ola, my husband, and this is Hans. So just so you get a quick idea, when I was 16, I met Ola. We wanted to become artists, and we had no career plans whatsoever. We were the lousiest students you can imagine. We were studying at the university, but barely enough to continue to sort of, be in the system. But we wanted to do art stuff, so we did that. And then Hans, who was teaching students in medicine students who was going to travel abroad, and he was always frustrated, and he couldn't stop himself from talking about his work things. And somewhere along those lines, he started showing his frustrations, and he had started trying to simplify the world in different charts and so on. And those charts were super interesting because they gave an overview, but they were not very beautiful, you could say, roughly. So on our spare time, we started doing things with those charts, and then we started doing them interactively and stuff. And once again, we had no career plans whatsoever. So it was just that this was so fun. So we studied less and less at the university. So we were pretty crappy students, honestly, because of that. But then eventually we had developed visualization tools and so on. So and then suddenly when we had gotten some grants to work on this, and when we had an office and when we had employees, it still took a few years before we realized that this was something we did as a work, because it always felt like we're just doing this now, and now we've been doing this for 20 years, and I assume we're stuck because it's so much left to do, and it's so interesting, I think. And why are we doing this? I think the key point is that we need to make good decisions, because we live in a world full of problems. We have wars, we have financial crises in different ways, climate crises, pandemics, all these kinds of big problems that we need to solve, and we need to do that together. And to do that, we need to make sure that we have peace, because otherwise we cannot collaborate, right? So to have peace, we need to understand each other. So it's somewhere along that line. So we need to make good decisions to get going on the big projects that we really need to work on. So what we have been focusing on, you can say, is the gap between what the data about the world says about the global trends and proportions and how humans tend to see the world, because there is a huge gap in between. So that is where we are sort of focusing. What can we do about that, and what does that gap look like? So we started by doing different kinds of charts and visualizations. We went to Google to improve search for statistical data. And actually we got a bit bored after a while, because it was pretty hard to get the data searchable, because the data is still not in a unified format, which we would need to have the data truly searchable, because the data would need to have a standard format. And that is slowly coming, but it still takes some time. So when we were at Google, we thought that we came to Google because we thought that people were sitting at home trying to search for all these global public data that we were so interested in. And unfortunately, we saw life expectancy was the only search term that had some volume. All the other global public data sets that we have been looking at and indicators had very modest search volume. So we came to Google to solve what we thought were people were searching and getting bad results back. But we saw they were not searching that much, which was a bit disappointing. But this one they searched for, but only in combination with one other word, cat. So that was the huge disappointment. Then we realized that they don't care about the world, actually. They just want to know whether their cat, how old will their cat become. And we have, for some reason I cannot really understand, our family has 4 cats, and sometimes I also wonder how old can they be, and I sort of Googled that, and that's when they are very annoying or super cute, right? So I don't know which reason was the main one. But then we decided to leave Google because we realized just what few people are searching for global statistics. We know they will not get good enough results. And we also knew that whatever you put in the search field might not be the most relevant thing to know, because you might get an answer, but was that the relevant question you should ask, right? So we decided to try to put things together, and we wrote the book, Factfulness. And the book consists of, it starts with asking 13 fact questions. It's along the same line that Hans, you were mentioning, Hans was testing. So we had 13 questions that we were asking to the general public. After the book came out, we was actually more curious, because you could think that 13 fact question is a very modest number, right? So we totally got obsessed with fact questions, and now we have asked about 15,000 fact questions, and we asked in so many different fields because we wanted to sort of get an idea what people are wrong about and how the worldview looks. So we have been asking tons of questions recently. And I was asking you, gave you some questions as well. So you got 15 questions to answer, and we're now going to look at your results. So do you think at this point that you were doing amazing? No. So this is just the questions. We will just look briefly. I will show you just very, very quickly how many % wrong you got on the different questions. So here you can see the majority of you are getting these wrong. So it's just to get an idea about the amount of wrong, right? As you can see here, these were the different questions. Maybe, I think, when more than 85% wrong, maybe we can have a little bit closer look at these ones. So there is something, I knew on beforehand that most likely you would get these wrong because we have been asking them in so many places, and we have seen that people are systematically wrong and in the same way quite often. And when 90% are wrong about a question, then it's not a matter of ideology, right? Because then you will have people of all different like political colors in that. So it's something else going on. So let's look at 4 of the questions, the ones at the bottom. We start by, in 1990, 58% of the world population lived in low-income countries. What is the share today? 9, 37, or 61%? Correct is 9, so it has dropped quite a lot. And we asked this in different countries. I'm just going to show you your result in comparison with others. US, most people was wrong. Poland, Sweden, China, and you. So you can see you're sort of pretty well aligned with results from some other places. And we did ask in a lot of places, and you can see here at the top, you have some countries, typical European countries, and at the bottom, typical non-European countries. So the ones who were scoring the best, the country scoring best on this question was actually Saudi Arabia. Just sort of get that into your mind, that sometimes we tend to think that as Europeans we have our education and our history, and of course we will have an idea about the world. But on this one, I mean, majorities are wrong in Saudi Arabia as well, so it's not very impressive results for them either. But they are actually, together with United Arab Emirates, China, Turkey, and Singapore, those were the ones least wrong on this. Pretty interesting, I think. So what has happened then? This is the world. Every bubble is a country, the size is the population, and the color is the region. So the 2 big ones are China and India back there. And this is in 1988. We could see that 56% of the countries were in low-income countries. And since then, we can see how the population has actually started moving. They become richer, and they become healthier. And as you can see, when we come more closer to today, there is only a fraction left of the population in low-income countries. But in our minds, we have the majority of the world population in the poor countries. So there's something happening in the world that we don't really notice, which affects how we see the world. Then we had, in which countries are people on average least satisfied with their lives? Low, middle, or high-income countries? Correct is low. But when we look in different countries, as you can see, not as wrong here, but this is very typical. Actually, when we look at the countries, the averages of countries, they are not as wrong as on the other question. But as soon as we enter a room with people that are highly interested in high and middle income countries, expert audiences, this one tends to go up. And quite often it goes up all the way to 95, 97, and so on. So there is something happening. Why do we think that people in low-income countries are more satisfied with their lives than in high-income countries. Pretty strange. And I think it might be this, that when we are like highly educated and we are working quite a lot, maybe we start dreaming about a simpler life, the things that don't cost, you know, having time to spend with family and friends, bonfires, nature, all those things. And then we sort of get an idealistic image of what life would be. And we think of smiling kids and where we go to with vacations and so on, all these nice things. But we should remember that living in low-income homes, quite often in low-income countries, you would sleep on the mat with your whole family with no privacy. You would brush your teeth using your finger. You would go to the toilet using the bush or field, and you would eat the same porridge every single day, and your kids would have the risk of dying, and you might not get them to education. So, I mean, there is a lot of things that makes life a bit more complicated in low-income countries, and still we tend to make idealistic views of a happier life, which I think is pretty interesting. And then we have this one: how many countries have made cooperation agreements with China's Road and Belt Initiative? 40, 80, or 140. It's even more now. But it's this one. And we asked in Japan, they had no clue. We asked in the US, UK, and you. So this one is pretty interesting, I think, because we in Europe, we still think that we can sit here and sort of define what should happen in the world, what we think is okay. But meanwhile, it's already happening, right? It has already happened. So we are like lacking behind both on population trends and collaboration trends. And I think that is pretty interesting. And then we have the last one of the four where you scored the worst. How many companies in the world have a woman as a top manager or CEO? 2, 10, or 18%. I mean, all these three are pretty bad numbers, right? So it's not that it's like equal representation, but people tend to think that it's worse than it actually is, because it is actually the 18%, but people are totally wrong about this too. So I just wanted you to see the trends here. And I think when we score higher here, I think that is when we have when we are interested in the inequality, then we tend to see all the problems, but we sort of, as in many other things, we tend to miss the positive trends. Because if we look, 18% are of the top managers globally are actually women. And if we look in the US, the top 500 countries, it's 10%, and it's a pretty steep rise. So things are changing. I'm just going to show you some heads of female leaders, so we can just remind ourselves that they are actually already today getting representation, right? So looking at your result, we had 15 questions that you could answer. You could get score between 0 and 15, right? And this is your result. 2 people scored 0, which I think is pretty impressive, because you had 15 ABC questions, and getting every single one of them is somewhat of an advanced thing. So, and the room for improvement from here on is pretty big here, right? But then the rest of you came here, and no one up here. And this is what we actually get quite often. So it's pretty interesting to see that we are, even if we're highly educated and smart and interested, right, we still tend to get things wrong. And I'm not assuming that you know the questions I was asking, because of course you couldn't. But the interesting thing I would say is that you are guessing in a similar manner, and that actually makes you end up in this end. So your average score was 3.6 out of 15, and to prove the point here with the chimpanzee, if we would have asked a chimpanzee, A, B, C, it would pick randomly, right? So it's 1 in 3 that you would get it correct. So you should actually have ended up here as an average, and you almost did, right? Close, but not really. You're not there totally, but you're getting there. And just to show here, like, yes, 69% of you was actually below the chimpanzee. So Just wanted to show another test that we did with thousands of people in especially Scandinavia, asking about some UN goals. And you can see it's almost the same shape, right? To them we asked 18 questions. And the interesting thing here, 3.2 was their average. The monkey would have ended up here. And we tried what ChatGPT would do. And it turns out that it would not score totally correct either, of course, because it's also getting just information from what humans produce. But it's still interesting and a bit sad to see this picture, right? That we are in the third place. I mean, we should be able to overcome and beat the other two, right? So the good thing with human minds is if we are aware that we're scoring this bad, it's pretty easy to upgrade, right? It's not that hard. It's just that we cannot rely on our gut feelings. We need to make sure that we use data and the data exists. So we can actually do things. And I mean, neither the chimpanzee or ChatGPT should make decisions about society and where we're heading, because we have a lot of other things. We can dream, we have innovation, we have empathy, we have a lot of things that actually makes us better decision makers. But maybe we should actually make some use of the memory capacity that the AI has, because our brains seem to be pretty bad at storing the information. And we've been doing some project with Washington Post, where they have been testing their audience using questions we have constructed, and we see the same pattern there. People are usually pretty bad about the world around them. So here is an example of that. We made an index, we call it the Gapminder Index, where we went to 3 countries, UK, Japan, and Brazil, and we asked about the level of vaccination, schooling, and the electricity of all countries. So we wanted to know how you see the world. And we have only tried this in 3 countries, so it's sort of a pilot, but I think it's pretty interesting, because this is what it looks like. So everything purple was totally underestimated progress, and everything yellow was somewhat okay, right? Somewhat close to what the data tells. So if we take a closer look, we can see Sweden at the top. So this is all the countries and the actual progress in those. We made an index of the 3: electricity, schooling, and vaccination, right? So most countries have pretty good coverage of that. As you can see, they are on the top. And this is how people perceive the world. As you can see, there's a huge gap between the data about the world and the perception about the world. And how can we collaborate globally if we totally underestimate the progress in different countries? Most likely we will think that they are in a different position, and maybe that will screw up some collaborations. So if we look at Sweden, we can see the actual progress was 99%, and it was perceived as 92%. So Sweden was actually the country of the ones we tested where they were least wrong, which felt a bit embarrassing, as we are from Sweden, right? So it felt like we had primed the whole study, but we didn't. That was the result. If we look at Lithuania, for instance, same level as Sweden in actual development, access to these progress goals, but this is where it's perceived to be. And if we look at Senegal, you can see an even bigger diversity. So what does this do with the way we collaborate? If people perceive that only half, that you're that far away from what you actually are when it comes to development, I think that's pretty interesting, right? Should I? Oh. So here, among the richest countries in the world, these ones were the most misunderstood, just so you get an idea, where there was the biggest gap between the actual and the perceived ideas. So when we've been asking all these fact questions and making our index, you could say we had some findings. First of all, that people tend to be very wrong about the world they live in. They are systematically wrong, so they are wrong in the same ways. They have stereotypes about people in other countries and other cultures. And human progress is very often underestimated. We forget that humans have actually progressed quite a lot. while everything that was like advanced tech and, you know, cool new science stuff, we tend to overestimate. So that has some implications, right, for how we work on things. So quite often I get to hear that being optimistic, because I would say we are pretty optimistic at Gapminder, because we've seen all the amazing human progress that has actually happened. But as soon as you are somewhat optimistic, people think that you are naive. You know, you're always like, you know. While being a critical thinker, that is almost the same as saying that you're a pessimist. When you hear being critical, it's like you show that by being negative or shooting down things. I mean, that is how we're training, how we train to be like academic and see the world, which is good. I mean, we should do that. But whenever there are positive trends, there's a huge risk that we cannot really talk about them, because it sounds like we are naive or idealistic in ways. So I think that is pretty interesting, that when trends are positive, then maybe we should dare to be some optimistic that we can actually achieve other things as well. So why are we wrong about the world then? Well, I think one of the key things is what we learned in school. Even if that was correct, it gets outdated, right? So we cannot rely on that, because the world keeps changing. And if we look out the window, I mean, we get a limited view, right? We cannot really see the whole world. It's too narrow. And then most of us tries to compensate by watching the news or reading news, watching news, whatever. And then we see a lot of different things happening, but we only see the dramatic, because they don't, I mean, that's the news logic, right? It doesn't get into the news unless it's over dramatic or super exotic in different ways. So here's an example of that. We're going to look at causes of death in the US, media versus reality. This is New York Times. How many percentage of the coverage of the death causes were covered? So diseases and accidents, they talked somewhat about that. Suicides, homicides, and deaths by terror. So you could see this was how they were covering the news. If we look in the data instead, what did Americans actually die from? Of course, people died from diseases and accidents. There were a few suicides, some homicides, and almost no deaths from terror. So even if New York Times were correct in every single news piece, the proportions, I think, help to skew the way we see the world, because the proportions get wrong, even though, So I think just remembering that the world, if you look in the data, are seldom as interesting, exotic, and wild as it would be in the news, but you will get skewed proportions in the news. So now I'm just going to go through a few trends of positive things that has happened over time that we very seldom hear about because they don't make it into the news. I will just rush through them. Women can vote in most countries today. More people can read and write. We have more movies to choose from. Back there in 1910, if you have already went to the movies, hope you liked the movie. Now you can choose from more, right? There are much more science articles. We have more mobile phones. More countries are competing in the Olympic Games. We have a bigger harvest per area. We have more girls than boys finishing primary schools. We have more internet users. More species are actually being evaluated so that we can monitor how it goes, which, by the way, goes pretty badly, but they are at least monitored, which is good. We have more babies getting vaccinated. We have life expectancy has increased from year 1800. It has more than doubled. We have more land being protected. I mean, all these things should be celebrated, but we barely hear about them because it's like slow trends. There are no point in time when it's talked about. Then we have bad things that has decreased, which is also a good thing. Fewer people die from indoor pollution. Fewer people die from hunger. Smallpox is gone. We have fewer ozone-depleting gases. Legal slavery is no longer okay in countries. Fewer children are dying. Fewer people die from HIV infections. Fewer Solar panel cost has decreased a lot. Fewer oil tanker spills. We don't have lead in gasoline anymore. Fewer kids are working. I mean, it's a lot of things that has actually happened that we tend to forget about. And this is the world as we see it today. 8 billion people, and this is where they live. Just as a remembrance, 1115, we can think from left to right, so that we can keep track of where people are, right? So whenever there is a problem, yeah, just keeping the proportions, basically. And in the future, this is what's going to happen according to the UN. There will be more people, but those people will be in Africa. It will actually even decrease in Europe, as you might know. But we could still round to a full figure, but it will keep decreasing. So if we want to be part of global collaborations, we who are sort of here, the classical West and Europe, we will be such a tiny, tiny portion of the world population. So if we don't behave, no one will pay attention. No one will care, right? Because we are going to be a fraction of the world population. So that's worth thinking about, right? So here we see the world population ordered by income. So it's like people all over. And you can see you have the extremely poor, we have the relative poverty, and if we divide it like this, we can say that the poorest 10% we have over there, and then we can put the world into 10 different figures, like 10% of the world population per figure, right? So this is what the world population looks like roughly. And if we look at food, how people eat, what people eat on different income levels, we can see here, on the poorest end, you will have the same porridge every single meal, every single day. Here you will have nutritious food, but not very fun. Here you start to get some variation, and up here you will start to choose for every single meal what you want to have for that specific day and that specific dish, right? So looking at the data here, we could say 70% of the world population have enough, nutritious and okay food. We have some that has some food insecurity, it's not very stable, and then we have a little segment who's sometimes even missing food, right? And here I think I just wanted to mention, I also asked you the question, what causes most deaths in the world? Is it cancer, heart disease and stroke, or lack of food? And heart disease and stroke is the correct answer, even in Africa, by the way, which was another question. And in the UK, this was the result. You were actually scoring pretty good here. So this is a good result. Only half of you was totally wrong here, right? But if we look, it was actually 46% saying that lack of food was the main cause of death. But actually, it's only 0.4% of all deaths that come from lack of food. So you would still 100 times wrong, right? So I just think we have to keep that in mind, that even if your result looked pretty good on this question, that half of you were 100% wrong, 100 times wrong, I think is still, worth remembering that 100 times wrong might be bad enough, right? And then if we look at water, here we have the poorest, they will have to go and fetch water, surface water. And as you can see here on the image, you see that they are washing, they are swimming, and they are getting their drinking water in the same spot. Come up here, you might have a tap somewhere close to home, or even outside of your home, cold water. Here, cold and hot water indoors in your own home. And on this level, you will start to see running hot and cold water in several places within your own home. So looking at water, we can see, and actually most of the human basic needs are actually met today. And we tend to underestimate that as well. So when the UN says that the goal for 2030 is to basically make all people access these human basic needs, it's not very unrealistic, because we're quite close to reach that. But in humans' minds, as people think that the problems are much, much bigger, they might be over pessimistic, thinking it's impossible to reach there. But it's just the last mile, right? So we can look at transport. The poorest, they will have to walk if they're going to get somewhere. Thereafter, we will have people, they have access to bike, motorbike, or car. And if we break this down into population figures, we can see that the majority of the world population today, they live on the second level, the bike level, and most of them are in Asia. If current trends continue, this is what's going to happen until 2040. The population will continue to increase, and if current economic trends continue, people will move more in this direction. Fewer will be extremely poor, and the majority will move upwards. So when we think about the global market of today, it's just like a trailer for the future, right? Because it will be so much more people and so much more actually on the level where they can consume quite a lot. So UN, is talking quite a lot about sustainable development goals. And if we talk about the word sustainable development, I think it's pretty interesting. You can simplify it quite a lot, where we can talk about sustainable could be represented by CO2 emissions, roughly. And it comes from a lot of different things. And we can have development, which is like human development, and we can measure that by child deaths. And you can die from a lot of different things, right? And if we look at that, we can see that the emissions, they happen up here. And the deaths, they are happening down there. So quite often when we think about sustainable development, we tend to think that we are going to do projects to work on both of them at the same time as we group them together verbally. And quite many projects end up in the middle of the world population working on sort of mixed projects on both of them. But if we're going to solve the climate crisis, starting here looks pretty reasonable. And if we're going to remove extreme poverty and save kids, then we should start in the poorest end, right? So just to give you an overview of sort of breaking down the UN goals, there are 17 goals and super many indicators behind that. But roughly you could say these are the two main things, just so we keep in mind the extreme difference of the two different projects. So to understand the world, we do need data and we do need frameworks so that we can actually think about the world reasonably. But we also need something else. We need something to outsmart the random and, the chimp. Because for some reason, our brains tend to think stupidly enough and save information in bad ways. So therefore, in the book, we developed 10 thinking habits that we thought might help at least a little bit, so that we could keep focused on trying to foster our thinking a little bit without working too hard. Because, to be realistic, most people are totally occupied in their lives already. So having everyone sit down and learn everything about the world trends and proportions by heart might not be realistic. So how can we make sure that we are overall less wrong about the world around us, and that we go check numbers often, but not being as wrong when we are guessing? So we developed some thinking habits that we thought could actually work to foster our instincts, the way we intuitively think about the world around us. So I will walk through them super quick. First, we have the gap instinct, that we tend to talk about huge differences. We always talk about outliers, the poor and rich, the happy and sad, and all these, always conflict, the good and the bad, the left and the right, and so on. But to understand the world, we should always remind ourselves to locate the majority, because we seldom talk about the majority because it doesn't really make it into the news and it doesn't really make it into our thinking. But by focusing on the majority, we will have an easier time understanding what is actually going on. And then we have the negativity instinct. We hear it's just getting worse, and we hear it all the time, and we think it ourselves, right? But would an improvement get publicity? That we should remind ourselves, just as a thinking. It wouldn't, because we never see this. Yesterday, all trains were on time again. The timetable is slightly improved. No plane crashes today either. We don't see that because that's not the logic. But that is the correct thing, right? Because quite often things are improving and we never hear about the improvements. We just hear about the dips. And then when we see a trend line, a chart, we tend to, our brains fill it in, right? Because we see the trend and we know what's going to happen. But then we can just remind ourselves, all lines are not behaving that way. Trends might go in different ways. We should not rely on our brain's way of filling it in. We have the fear instinct that we tend to be driven towards scary stories and everything like juicy. There was a story, I don't know if you remember, but there was a 2-year-old or something who was eaten by an alligator at Disneyland in Florida. I mean, that is a typical story that you tend to remember because it has everything bad in it, right? But the reason, but should you go around and be afraid of being eaten by an alligator at Disneyland? Probably not, right? But that tends to stick even in my mind as well. But we should calculate the risks. We're afraid of spiders, but we're getting killed by cars rather than spiders, right? And then we have the size instincts that we tend, whenever we talk about global problems, they sound very huge, right? But we need to compare with something. Otherwise, we cannot know whether it's a huge or a small thing. Here, for instance, this is the number of dead infants in 2020 in the world. 3,865,000. Horrible number. But 2015, it was even worse. And 1950, it was much worse. So trying to remember that something can be bad, but still better than it used to be. Bad and better at the same time. Generalization, we tend to generalize things in stupid ways and group things in stupid ways. Here we have a boat with refugees crossing the Mediterranean, people trying to avoid, wars and so on, coming to Europe. And a lot of these boats, people were risking their lives to come to Europe. And it's very easy to group them together as if they were the same, right? One of these boats, I read in a paper, ended up here on a nudist beach in Spain. And I'm just thinking, for the people escaping, risking their lives, crossing the oceans, surviving, coming here, how long time will it take for them to realize that not all European men are pink with hats, glasses, and no clothes, right? So we have to compensate for that. So I think it's pretty interesting from their point of view. They had no idea that this was what they could end up with, I guess. Pretty, a fascinating start, you could say. And then we have the destiny instinct, that we tend to think that the world is static and that people will be as they have always been, and cultures and religions are static. But most things move. It's just that they are moving so slow, so we don't really pay attention. We have the single solution. When we are good at something, we want to apply it on everything. But of course, we should have a toolbox. We love to blame certain individuals for bigger problems, and we should try to avoid that, right? Because it's usually more complex. And then we have the urgency. When we see a huge problem, we tend to be very engaged, very dramatic driven, and we want to do big things immediately. But then we could remind ourselves that we can take one step at a time, and usually it's a bad idea to make big decisions when we are very emotional, because we might make the wrong ones. So we should try to take it carefully, and we can usually adjust as we go. So those are just some rules of thumb to sort of help remind us that we can apply some very, very basic thinking habits that might help us direct and steer the thinking. And if we think about the old society we come from, where we had a few experts sitting as gatekeepers on the knowledge, and sometimes they came out of their tower and gave us a number or an information. And now we're going towards a society where we actually can find information on our own. It's a huge shift. And now when we can find the information, we can actually actively change the way we make decisions by double-checking information. Because if we look at the brain, we cannot trust our gut feeling, because the gut feeling will take us wrong in our understanding about the world we live in. And if we ask colleagues and friends, it will not help either, because it seems like most of us have the same type of biases about the world we live in. So we need to find ways of, or adding habits where we go and double-check data before making decisions. Just being sort of humble, curious and keep the hope. Because we should remember that a lot of things has actually improved over time, and if we can rely on that, thinking that even under bad circumstances, human progress has been amazing. Now we face, for instance, the climate crisis that doesn't look very good, right? But we have never before been as good, as well educated. We have better technology, we have better research, and we have better communication skills and better ways of collaborating globally. So maybe we can actually find ways of doing things. So I think we should remember the progress that has happened so that we dare dig into the problems we have ahead. But to do that, we need to use data, because if we don't, there is a huge risk that we do the wrong prioritizations and do the wrong projects. And that we cannot afford. We should do that what is most effective, right? So I think for the future, what we need is to actually figure out how we can improve the data literacy. We need to have some data literacy so that we can work with the numbers that now actually exists. So that is a key thing, I think, for educational system, but also for each and every one of us trying to figure out how we can become more data literate and rely more on data. Because when we think that we know the world around us, there's a huge risk that we will make the wrong decisions, because we are quite often systematically wrong about the world we live in. And when you did the test, you can actually go back and do what we call take exam. That means if you go back again and you can get a version of the test that is on time, if you answer all questions correct in a row, then you will get a bravo, and then you will get a certificate that you can print if you want to. And the good thing is you can do this over and over again until you actually get all correct in a row. Some people say, but is that really learning? Isn't that cheating? But I mean, isn't that how... I mean, we learn by repeating, so it might be some learning as well. But you can get a diploma if you want to compensate for the bad feeling of the low scores. So that is a good thing. So just to end, I just want to remind you that there is a huge gap between the way we perceive the world around us and what the data says about the world. And we should really be humble and embrace that, so that we remember to actually check the numbers before making decisions. So mind the gap, and if you want to talk more, I think we're going to have a Q&A now, so I will be here. But if you want to talk more later, I would go for this, because sometimes I try to be social media active, but I always fail and stop doing that, so it doesn't really work. So, but emails I check. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Wow, a ray of hope. You know, we really need it, because, you know, with all that's going on in the world, to question ourselves is so important. And it just, I don't know, what about you guys, but for me, it just made me feel better. How many of you read the book Factfulness? Wow, many fans, as you can see. Now we have around, 20, 30 minutes of Q&A. So can you, for those who have a question, raise your hand and wait for a microphone so everyone can hear your question. And so who's the first one? Who's the bravest in this auditorium? Wow, okay. The microphone here.
The bravest.
Hello, Anna. My name is Gražina. I'm representing a bioinformatics company, and we work a lot with medical data. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask more specific question. You mentioned at the end that we need some knowledge how to work with the data. Would you be able to mention from your science side of view, how do you get the data? Maybe a couple of examples. How do you analyze, do you apply any statistical models, and just maybe a few things to mention to us.
So yeah, you might keep the mic. I would say, if you think if I missed the point, or if you have some follow up because you think I missed the point. When I talk about like data literacy, I'm not talking so much about advanced statistical modeling, because that is something experts are doing and can continue doing, and where you can get an overview. I think much more about a very basic skill set where you're actually using data and compare data. You make sure you're like the ones I showed, where you make sure that you're not relying on one single number. You need to compare it with something, or you need to look at the time trends to see how it has moved. More like a super basic visual way of analyzing the data. I think we need the other things as well, but I do think we need to upgrade how we use the basic tables, so to say, and make basic visualizations on them, like line charts and, super basic. But I think we have to find habits where we actually apply that. Because I think there is a lot of insights in the very basic analysis as well that we tend to forget. And when we pour a lot of data into the softwares who gives us the statistical models, that is one side of it. But quite often we can learn things even from a very simpler way of reaching the information. And I do think that quite often what we do, we put a lot of data into our tools, and then we start browsing them and just visually look for is there a pattern, is there a trend over time, like with the bubbles. If you can see that there is a movement, what does that mean? And if we're going to take an example out of that, maybe we should not take the extreme outliers. Maybe we should focus on something in the middle, like the one I showed with the Gapminder index. I think Lithuania was probably the best example. You had Sweden, an extreme that people were basically not wrong about. You had Senegal that people were very wrong about. But then you had Lithuania in the middle, where people were quite wrong, but it was very representative of, how big the how wrong people are about countries sort of in the middle, that they cannot really, that they are underestimating, but not all the way, but trying to get the picture in that sense.
Thank you so much.
Did you think I made somewhat sense?
Yeah, a lot, and I probably also understood that you use some generally used practices of analyzing data, but do you have also data scientists on your team?
Yes and no. In periods we have that. At the moment we don't have anyone with a degree in data science, but we do have my husband, who has been the data science since we started, and I think he's one of the more advanced, I would say. So he's in direct contact with researchers in the biggest organization like World Bank and the UN, and they are discussing ridiculous nitty-gritty details about the data collections and so on. So yes and no. Over a period of time, we had some data scientists that had that title as well. But sometimes part of what we do is that we put emphasis on actually visualizing data. So to make the bubbles move, for instance, sometimes we combine different data sets to make it a movement without gaps, because data is always full of gaps, right? And just mixing data sets together, sometimes the researchers in different communities would not agree. They would say you cannot do that. But we still claim you can, because people's worldview is so skewed. So we need to find visual ways of representing the world that is all as good as possible. But especially we need to get in here. So whenever you see those gaps, it might be a bigger problem that people don't get the overview. It's so it's sort of data is never perfect, but sometimes you have to work on it so that it becomes understandable. And I think in some cases we prioritize getting things understandable to getting it totally correct. And some of the data scientists would stop immediately and say, nope, we cannot touch this. And we say, yes, it's not perfect, but we need to touch it because people are totally wrong. We can at least take them a bit on the journey, and then we can keep together refining. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was clear and very interesting discoveries. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question and being the first one to ask. I also actually have a question. Since most of us are totally wrong, but most of us think that we know the world better than we actually do, how do we talk to each other and how we live with each other? Because if we think that, you know, we have this Dunning-Kruger syndrome, it turns out. So how do we live in a society and make decisions?
I mean, as long as we're all wrong in the same way as we seem to be now, it's pretty easy, right? But the question is it optimal? Maybe it would be better if we could like gradually move closer to like humbling, and by humbling I think we might be able to actually upgrade our understanding about the world a little bit. But without humbling, I think it's impossible. So realizing that we can still be proud experts in our fields, but we need to add a humble and curious aspect, realizing that the human brain is pretty bad at remembering everything, like the overviews and slow trends and global proportions. And we need maybe to make sure that before making decisions, we might be able to we might need to double check, even if everyone in the room agrees on what it's like, because we might still be a little bit deluded and wrong. So I just think, I mean, we are wrong in the same way quite often. So I mean, we can maybe get closer to reality together.
Thank you. We have more questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very thought-provoking, I would say. And if you allow, I would have two questions.
Yeah.
And you mentioned AI. I'm really glad to see it's doing better than Chimp, because I'm teaching AI applications myself, and that would be really sad if it was the other way around.
Yes. Alibaba is doing better than ChatGPT, it seems.
Okay. Okay, good to know that something is not that bad, actually. Okay, but the question is about your personal opinion. What do you think? How will this whole AI thing change, let's say, data literacy? Because it's changing quite a lot, the principles, how we search and how much do we care to think. Yeah. And if I may have the second question as well, is where should we actually draw the line? I mean, how much should we hamster in? Does it really make a world such a more better place if I know the average shoe size of a female CEO who is above 50? Or maybe there should be some kind of line where enough is enough? Yeah.
So I like both questions. For the first one, I would say I think actually we know that a lot of people are very afraid of AI, and of course things can go wrong and bad and so on. But we could also imagine that we could make use of it, because it seems like humans have limited resources in remembering like what we consider being the boring information. And statistics about the world seem to fit that area of the brain, like the boring things, right? So that doesn't really stay, it doesn't keep an active place of updating, I think, for most of us. So there I think we can actually make use of AI to be our storage of that knowledge. So maybe we can sort of make sure that AI trains on some kind of more like whitelisted information, because when we have made some pretty small tests so far by testing all our questions on different AI and so on. And it seems like most things where it's possible to get the data from a decent source, and when there is not very infected discussions, it seems like AI get pretty correct results. But then there are these highly debated topics with a lot of opinions, and there you can see how it follows the opinion, so to say. So I would say to make big use of AI, I think it needs, just like we need, a better search optimization for a standardized search for statistical data, which we still don't have. So it could go directly to the sources and get the numbers in a way. That I think. So I have good hopes for that, because it seems like humans are not, we're not very good at storing that information. But we can use it to make decisions, which I think AI should not, maybe, when it comes to whatever we should do with that information. And then the second question was, enough is enough, right? How much do we need to know? And I think that is a key thing. We're drowning in big data, and we need to make sure that we digest whatever is needed for us, not more than that, because we will not have the capability or the time or the interest. So we need to figure out ways to sort of shortcut and make sure that we have covered at least the basic ground. And that is hard enough, right? Because how do we know what we need to know that is outside of the field where we're in, right? So I think we have a lot of things, we as a society still have a lot of things to solve, to make sure that we teach data literacy to a decent enough level, that we teach thinking habits to a decent enough level, that we make laws and regulations around the production of like data and communication of data, so we have some way of navigating throughout the information sources to know what is reasonable sources and what is not. You know, you have a lot of, I think a lot of work needs to be done, but I still have, and I remember Hans, he got very irritated when he was very angry with journalists and others who didn't know enough about countries. So he always said that you need to learn this and this and this and this. And I was always very frustrated about that, because that is always because his big interest was, of course, the countries of the world. Others have interest in football or wines or whatever. And I think we have to also be realistic that just because we in Gapminder have the interest in these particular questions, most people have not. But then I think it's our responsibility trying to give you simplifications that I think you might need, even if they are outside of the main scope that you have for your work. Because I do think for making good decisions, we need to understand that we are in a global setting, so we cannot make decisions about just here, because a lot of things are happening in the world around us that we need to pay attention to and that we need to understand to make wise decisions for the long run, even here and now. Yeah, long. I'm not sure if it was a complete answer.
It was. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions coming. Told you started this with your first question. Yes, Inga.
Thank you, Anna. Fascinating presentation. Loved every second of it. My name is Inga Popovaitė. I'm a sociologist and also a data scientist. And kind of like really following up what you were answering right now about global versus a bit more local decision making, I was wondering, have you done any projects that you were measuring perceptions and actual facts on a bit more local basis, right? Because if one is not working on UN development goals or in global diplomacy, like we wouldn't even actually need to use the knowledge about all these different world countries, right? But on my everyday life, like let's say if I live in New York, I would actually need to know maybe my possibility of dying from terrorism or dying of like heart disease, right? So have you done any studies or any projects that has been more local, regional, and looking for gaps in perception and actual facts that are a bit like closer to, let's say, everyday life?
I would say, I mean, we have made the project where we are collecting photos, the Dollar Street project, where we go and see everyday life of homes on different income levels, which I would say could be one of those, where we try to compensate the worldview by actually adding pictures of everyday life on different income levels, where you can compare what life looks like. I can actually just see if I can show you briefly. If you could you add my screen? Let's see. I don't know. There it is. Oh no, you have the wrong. Never mind. There is a project called the Dollar Street, which tries to compensate for part of that, to see to see another portion than what you see in the news that might be interesting on a local level, where you could see that there are huge variation within your own country and so on. So that is one way we have been trying to do that. We also try to visualize the income inequality within countries by actually in the bubble chart split a country so that you can see how big the income gaps are between different income groups and so on, which might make sense. And we have made like a bubble chart version in Sweden where you can actually see all the, what do you call them, stadsdelar in Stockholm, Stockholm's, the smallest, boroughs, the smallest units, and you can compare a lot of different information on that level as well, which might make sense if you look at building projects or infrastructure or schooling or whatever. So yes, we have been doing some of that, but honestly, it feels like we have. I think our main interest has been to cover the global trends and proportions that people tend to miss or not be interested enough about. So I do think that the local projects people are doing somewhat successfully, but maybe they should be linked to a global overview at one point or another. But maybe that overview doesn't need to be much more advanced than what you just saw. Mm-hmm. Just remind you that, that, like for instance, that here in Europe, we're a tiny portion of the population in the world, and we are shrinking, and the world population at the same time is increasing. And maybe when we are making decisions for our own education, or for what languages to learn, or which countries to partner up with, it might be meaningful to remember that we are underestimating progress of most countries. I mean, so it's just like those kinds of overviews I think most of us need, even in our local work, just as a reminder now and then. But for the practical everyday life, you will, of course, not really need it.
Thank you. And really short follow-up questions. Mm-hmm. Do people tend to be less wrong about their local environment than about the global?
We haven't tested to that extent on local level, but we tried. We have made a smaller sample where we tested fact questions about all countries. And we tested that in a few countries, like with the Gapminder Index, kind of, because the Gapminder Index is based on a lot of questions like that. And it seems like people are more correct within their own countries, which is pretty decent. Sometimes we see a huge gap. Quite often, one of the gaps that we have seen that I think has been pretty interesting is especially former Eastern European countries seem to be totally underestimated, as you could see, like with the Lithuanian here, in the progress that people in other places, like people in Japan and Brazil, assume that almost no kids go to school here and so on. It's pretty interesting that the perception might not always be totally accurate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. More questions? Yes. We have time for 3 more, and then Anna, if you have your book here, Anna will sign the book if you want it.
Thank you for your presentation. What do you think perception plays, what role in a story-based worldview? And we will have free elections, and how this perception plays a role in a political field. And maybe another short is about the possibility of AI-based tools on when you can have the ability to search for some kind of data in research papers, not on the public side sites. So, like 2 topics.
I think I will start with the research. I think we're moving in a direction where when we're getting better at actually searching for information within the research community and sharing the research papers within the research community, I think we're moving in the direction when it doesn't really make sense to have it as a closed information. It should be accessible even from the outside, I think. because it's I truly believe in having open and free information. I think that is very key for making it possible to have an equal playing field for different players, big and small, should be able to compete in a way, right? Because when we have locked communities or we have paywalls, we have a very unequal access to information. So that, I think, has to go. And if we talk about in the storytelling portion and perception, I think if we don't manage to communicate so people understand instantly what we're trying to say, they have such a limited attention span, so we will have to we will have to accept that someone else who managed to communicate more so that they understand, they will win even if they are less correct, because we don't have the like the calories to spend on a lot of advanced thinking quite often. So I do think just doing research or just being correct is definitely not enough. We also need to make sure that we are reaching out, because otherwise someone else will take the spot. And when it comes to politics, it's easier for extremes to grab the attention because they can always talk about more exotic, dramatic things and have more dramatic standpoints and more clearer enemies. And it's easier for people, I think, to rely on those. So I think we have a huge burden of actually making sure that people have for once there is a democratic and free access to information so that anyone can find the information, and then that we make sure that important information is being communicated so that people can make their decisions. They should make their own decisions, right? Where they want to stand, how they want to read the data should be up to each and every one. But if they cannot see the data in a way they can understand, then it's pretty tricky. So I do think when we look at, they usually call it the third job of the universities, right? One is to teach, one is to research, and one is to communicate. And the communication part seldom has any funding or any plan for it, which I think is disastrous. We need to make sure that the information is also reaching out so that people can understand it, because people are not, I mean, we just need to face it. People are seldom that interested. When we have a very strong passion in a field, we quite often think that if people were just knew as much as I do, they would also be passionate. But most people will not be that, not even if they spent the time, which they will not, right? So how can we make sure that they at least make use of the important pieces of the information, or know where to find it and know how to digest it? So I think we should take it as a burden on ourselves that we need to make sure that we make the information understandable and accessible.
Thank you. Two more questions. Just by here, Algimantai. Just here. I remember your face afterwards. Then, okay.
Else wants to go first?
No, it's okay. You go first, then.
It's okay. Thank you very much. Super interesting lecture. My question is about data analysis again and the facts behind data. I love the sort of reminder that, well, data and statistics supposed to give us the big picture of the world, but sometimes it actually gets very fragmented. Mm-hmm. So my question is about how to ask the right questions when analyzing data and when thinking about the comparisons that we should make in order not to get into those pigeonholes or being very focused on particular things that might be wrong following the numbers, but it doesn't give the overview. And it's kind of linked, my question came from thinking about sustainability, sustainable development, more maybe business transition, because that's where I work with, and that's a huge area where a lot of miscommunication or misanalysis of data is happening. So yeah, I'm really curious if there is some snippet of tips of how to ask the right questions.
I think the number one is actually to remember that we are usually wrong to start with. That is the key thing, to actually start asking questions over at all, right? I think that that's the starting point. Probably it's a good thing to have a team with people from different backgrounds, because they will ask different kinds of questions to the same data. Probably it's good to visually look at the data together and try to see what the data says when we look at it. Just browsing the data visually and talking about it in a group where everyone are allowed to talk, even if there is a hierarchy, that you're allowed to talk over the hierarchical boundaries, and that you try to be a diverse group where people dare to talk. I think that is key, because quite often also indicators are hard to understand the names, the definitions, how they are measured, and when you have two tight teams with experts, they have already agreed on very specific definitions that almost no one else understands. So therefore, I think it's important to have a wider group where you dare to ask questions. Quite often, I think, and I think this is a habit from when data was something that you exclusively found within research communities and that was barely seen by others, that they could be very internal. But I think that is a whole working way of working that I think we need to refine, so that we communicate even within our working groups with words that we understand. Because I think very often in work settings we use abbreviations and we do different things, and it's a lot of buzzwords, and it's very hard to really know if we understand the things truly and if we have a similar understanding. And then I also think it's important to remember that, to remind ourselves that there is no perfect data either. So it's not that we can go somewhere and then there will be the amazing data sets just laying around. Quite often it is scattered and frustrating, and it's being redefined over the years, so you cannot make time series or whatever. I mean, it's a lot of problems, or too small samples, or whatever problems. But trying to be realizing that and still not giving up, even though the circumstances are bad. But because I do think we have a old habit from when the research communities were pretty closed, where they didn't have the need of making sense. Therefore, I think there is a tendency within research communities to not share their information. They don't want to be transparent. They don't want to be first out, because when people can see the data, it will be embarrassing, because there will be problems, there will be gaps, there will be inconsistencies, and whatever. It seldom looks very amazing. So I think we need to force and demand transparency, and then hope that the research community can see that the problems in the data might not be that they are stupid. It's just that data is always incomplete and has problems, and that we need to start talking about the data. So I think somewhere there, because I think when you talk about, if you say sustainability, for instance, it becomes a lot of buzzwords and a lot of either you have the greenwashing part of it, where the buzzwords are being used to tell like amazing stories, or you have like the doomsday argumentation on the other hand. And how to make sense of all that I think will be by being as transparent as possible around the data, and realizing that, of course, if you have companies, for instance, that are bragging about something good they do, of course they should be allowed to do that and be spearheading a change. But on the other hand, it's also understandable that people are feeling the doomsday feelings, because when you look at the climate trends, of course you can feel overwhelmed. So I think it's about trying to do the I mean, it's hard. It's not going to be perfect, and it's going to be frustrating, and it's going to take time, and it's going to change less than we want to. But staying in the field and not giving up, I think.
Thank you. Positive note again. Loving it. The last question I saw, you had a question, right? Can you please bring the microphone?
Thank you very much. Tack så mycket for the beautiful, really mind-blowing presentation in understanding that I know almost nothing. Three correct answers.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, that was very, very good. So I was just wondering, I was curious whether we know the reasons, or you could explain the reasons why these groups from Emirates were getting more answers right. What is the deal there? Do they get different information or schooling system? Is there any explanation for that? And what could we do to improve our? Thank you.
This is going to be guesswork. So I'm not saying that I know, but I do think that we might. I think being Europeans, we have been in the forefront when it comes to development and economy for so long. So I think we might be maybe a little bit too laid back. So we don't really notice that a lot of cool things happen elsewhere. We have generations back where we can rely on being like leading the world forward. So I think it's a little bit of an ignorance that I think goes through the education system and in our media channels and in our probably in the values we have in our families. And I think it's basically all over, because we have been a little bit content in a way, I guess, relying on doing pretty good. And I would say the Western European countries are scoring worse here, right? Because countries who have made a rapid progress or a big change seem to do better. So I think that countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Turkey and so on, you have within your family history, you have memories of a rapid change, rapid improvements, and I think that maybe helps to understand the width of the world, and you have some positive human progress that you can see within your families and within your societies, and that I guess it's being talked about. While here, things are, when I say here, I talk about like Europe in this case, but where you can see that the economy that used to be like just booming, and now the growth is like maybe not that fast, but it's fast in other places. I think we have a hard time to adjusting to that, and I don't know, I guess you've heard it many times as well, like in China, they're just copying, they have no innovation, and blah blah blah. But I mean, things are happening pretty rapidly, and if you compare the Swedish scores in maths with the scores you see in Asia for school kids, I think we have some catching up to do. I would say.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Anna, for coming and accepting this challenge. Thanks to our sponsors and partners for making this happen. And it was worth to wait 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, for asking again.
Thank you.
Thanks.